August 30th, 1945, Yokohama Harbor, Japan. The morning mist clung to the shattered docks as the USS Cavalier eased toward what remained of the pier, its grey hull stark against the fog-softened ruins of what had once been Japan's busiest port. Major Toshiro Hayashi stood rigidly at attention, his once immaculate uniform now a symbol of defeat, convinced that the Americans would bring only further humiliation to his broken homeland. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What neither Major Hayashi nor the women of Yokohama could possibly anticipate was how the arrival of black American soldiers would not only challenge decades of Japanese propaganda, but fundamentally transform their understanding of humanity in the aftermath of history's deadliest conflict. The Cavalier's massive gangway lowered with a mechanical groan. Major Hayashi narrowed his eyes, scanning the American troops disembarking in precise formation. Behind him stood a delegation of local officials and translators, all wearing expressions carved from stone. Among them was Akiko Tanaka, a 24-year-old teacher who had been hastily recruited as a translator due to her English studies at Tokyo Women's College before the war. She clutched her notebook tightly, having memorized the briefing materials distributed by the remaining military authorities. "Remember the instructions," Major Hayashi murmured to the small group of civilian representatives without turning his head. "Maintain dignity. Limit interaction. The women are not to make eye contact with the Negro soldiers. Their behavior is unpredictable." Akiko nodded dutifully, though curiosity burned within her. Throughout the war, Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as devils, barbaric, merciless creatures barely recognizable as human. The black soldiers had been depicted as particularly savage, with crude caricatures appearing in military pamphlets and newspapers. Yet as the first platoon marched down the gangway, their discipline and precision contradicted everything she had been told to expect. Lieutenant Marcus Washington of the 24th Infantry Regiment, 93rd Division, led his men with the practiced precision that had become second nature during 3 years of combat across the Pacific. At 28, Washington had risen from the segregated neighborhoods of Chicago to command respect through sheer competence, despite the Army's entrenched racism. He had fought with distinction in the Philippines and now faced perhaps his most complex mission, helping to occupy a defeated enemy whose racial ideology in many ways mirrored America's own prejudices. "Company, halt." Washington's voice carried across the pier, his men stopping in perfect unison. He noticed the Japanese delegation watching them, their expressions unreadable. What he couldn't know was that many of them were experiencing their first moment of cognitive dissonance. These weren't the undisciplined savages they had been warned about. Captain James Miller, a white officer from the 8th Army's Civil Affairs Unit, approached the Japanese delegation. "Major Hayashi, I presume? I'm Captain Miller. These men from the 24th Infantry will be assisting with security and distribution of supplies in the eastern sectors of the city." Major Hayashi bowed stiffly. "We are prepared to comply with occupation directives." While Miller and Hayashi exchanged formal greetings, Lieutenant Washington organized his men into squads. Sergeant Elijah Jones, a former sharecropper's son from Mississippi, directed soldiers to begin unloading supplies, crates of food, medicine, and construction materials that would begin the long process of rebuilding. "Look sharp, men," Jones called out. "We're making history today, whether these folks know it or not." Private First Class Robert Johnson, at just 19, the youngest in the platoon, noticed the Japanese civilians watching from behind makeshift barricades. Most averted their eyes when he looked their way, but a few young women stared openly, their expressions a mix of fear and undeniable curiosity. "They act like they never seen black folks before, Sarge," Johnson muttered. "They haven't," Jones replied simply. "Remember what the colonel said. We're ambassadors now, not just soldiers." As the day progressed, Akiko found herself assigned to Lieutenant Washington's unit, tasked with helping establish communication protocols with local ward offices. Despite Major Hayashi's warnings, she found the lieutenant's professional demeanor reassuring. His Japanese vocabulary was limited to a few memorized phrases, but his respect for protocol was evident. "Miss Tanaka, Please inform the district representatives that we'll begin food distribution tomorrow at 800, Washington said, consulting his clipboard. Priority goes to children and the elderly, Akiko translated, noting how the local officials seemed surprised by the organized approach. One elderly man, a former city administrator named Hideo Nakamura, whispered to her, "They are not what we expected." "The Americans?" she asked. "The colored ones," he clarified. "The propaganda said they were animals, barely trained, but this officer speaks more formally than the white soldiers I met yesterday." By late afternoon, Lieutenant Washington's platoon had established a command post in what had once been a municipal building. The men worked with efficient precision, setting up communications equipment and organizing security rotations. Captain Miller returned briefly to check on their progress. "Fine work, Lieutenant," Miller said, though his tone carried the faint condescension Washington had grown accustomed to. "Any issues with the locals?" "None, sir," Washington replied. "They're cooperative, if cautious. Keep it that way. 8th Army wants this occupation to be a model of efficiency. The brass is watching your unit especially closely, you understand." Washington understood perfectly. His men were under greater scrutiny than any white unit would be. "My men know what's at stake, sir." After Miller departed, Sergeant Jones approached. "Same old story, huh, Lieutenant?" "Focus on the mission, Sergeant," Washington replied, though his tight smile acknowledged the unspoken reality. "We've got supply inventories to complete before sunset." Throughout that first day, word spread through Yokohama about the black American soldiers. Despite official warnings, curiosity overcame fear. Mothers who had hidden their children from the expected American devils now watched cautiously as black GIs distributed chocolate to wide-eyed youngsters. Elderly people prepared for brutality instead received medical attention from combat medics like Corporal Benjamin Lewis, who had been a nursing student at Howard University before the war. Akiko's younger sister, Yuki, arrived at the command post in the late afternoon, ostensibly bringing her sister a home-cooked meal. At 20, Yuki represented a generation less hardened by wartime propaganda. Her English was rudimentary, but her curiosity unbounded. "These are the Americans you work with," Yuki whispered, her eyes wide as she watched soldiers unloading medical supplies. "They look so different from the pictures." "Hush," Akiko cautioned. "Major Hayashi has warned us not to appear too interested. It could be misinterpreted." "But they're helping us," Yuki observed. "After everything our leaders said Americans would do if they won." A few yards away, Private Johnson noticed the two women and offered a polite nod. Yuki, despite her sister's warning, smiled briefly before looking away. That evening, Major Hayashi called an emergency meeting with neighborhood representatives. Reports had come in that Japanese women were being seen conversing with black American soldiers, something his superiors found deeply troubling despite the occupation. "This fraternization must not be permitted," Hayashi insisted to the assembled community leaders in the damaged town hall. "General MacArthur's headquarters has assured us that Japanese customs will be respected, but we must maintain proper distance, especially from the Negro troops." From the back of the room, an older woman named Mrs. Saito, who had lost her husband and 2 sons in the war, spoke up. "My grandson was trapped in rubble this morning. One of these black soldiers lifted a beam that 3 of our men could not move. Should I have refused his help based on his skin color?" Major Hayashi's expression hardened. "Individual acts do not change the necessary protocols. We have been defeated militarily, but we must preserve our cultural dignity." Across town, in the converted school building serving as temporary barracks, Lieutenant Washington's men were comparing their experiences of their first day in Japan. "These people don't know what to make of us," Corporal Lewis observed, cleaning his spectacles. "I had a grandmother today who looked like she'd seen a ghost when I gave her antibiotics for her cough. You notice how they won't look us in the eye," Private Johnson added. "Except the young ones, they stare like we got 2 heads." Sergeant Jones, who was writing a letter to his wife by lantern light, looked up. "Remember, most of them have never seen a black person except in propaganda. Give them time." Lieutenant Washington entered, setting down a stack of orders. "New directives from headquarters, men. We'll be here at least 6 months, rotating between security duty and civil assistance. The Eighth Army wants to demonstrate American values in practice. American values, Corporal Lewis repeated with a dry laugh. Which America are we supposed to be showing them, Lieutenant? The one that still has colored water fountains back home. A moment of uncomfortable silence followed. Washington sighed. We show them the America we're fighting for, not the one we left behind. Get some rest. Tomorrow's distribution starts at dawn. The next morning brought unexpected challenges. A crowd had gathered at the main distribution point before sunrise, far larger than anticipated. Rumors had spread overnight that the black American soldiers were giving out not just food, but also medicine and clothing. As Lieutenant Washington's platoon arrived with supply trucks, the crowd surged forward. "Maintain order," Washington called out to his men. "Sergeant Jones, establish a perimeter. Corporal Lewis, get the medical station set up to the left." Akiko arrived minutes later, alarmed by the size of the gathering. "Lieutenant, there are too many people. Some have walked from villages 10 miles away after hearing about yesterday's distribution." Washington assessed the situation quickly. "Tell them we have enough for everyone, but they must form lines by neighborhood. Children and elderly first, then women, then men." As Akiko translated these instructions, another translator, a middle-aged man named Kenji Sato, who had been assigned by Major Hayashi, arrived. He pulled Akiko aside. "Major Hayashi is concerned about reports of inappropriate interaction," Sato whispered sternly. "Remind the women not to engage directly with the Negro soldiers. No eye contact, no unnecessary conversation." Akiko frowned. "That makes my job impossible, Sato-san. How can I translate effectively without looking at the person I'm speaking with?" "Find a way," he insisted. "These are difficult times that require compromise." As the distribution began, Washington noticed how the male translators would not address him directly, instead speaking to Private Williams, a white soldier attached to their unit. The women translators, however, seemed torn between following instructions and practical necessity. By mid-morning, the system was functioning smoothly despite these complications. Sergeant Jones had organized an efficient process, with soldiers checking family registration cards and distributing appropriate rations. Private Johnson worked alongside a Japanese volunteer named Hiroki, a teenager who had picked up English from American movies before they were banned during the war. "These people are hungry," Johnson observed as he handed out rice and canned goods to a seemingly endless line of families. "Many have not had proper food for months," Hiroki confirmed. "The military took most supplies toward the end." "Well, they're getting the good stuff today. American rations beat what we were eating in the Philippines, that's for sure." Throughout the day, the tension between official protocols and human necessity became increasingly apparent. Major Hayashi made an appearance around noon, watching with evident disapproval as Japanese civilians interacted with black soldiers. He pulled several women out of the line, lecturing them publicly for making conversation beyond what was strictly necessary. Lieutenant Washington observed this, but maintained his professional demeanor. When Akiko approached to relay an urgent message about medical supplies, she kept her eyes fixed on his shoulder. "Miss Tanaka," Washington said quietly, "is there a reason you won't look at me today?" Akiko hesitated. "We have been instructed to minimize direct contact with American soldiers, Lieutenant." "I see," Washington replied, understanding immediately. "And yet we need to work together to help these people." "Yes," she acknowledged, finally meeting his gaze briefly. "It is complicated." The complexity only increased when 3 young children broke away from their mother and ran directly to Private Johnson, who had given them chocolate the previous day. Their mother looked mortified, bowing apologetically as she tried to collect her children. Johnson simply smiled, reaching into his pocket for more candy. "It's no problem, Mum," he said, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. The universal language of a kind gesture needed no translation. By the end of the second day, cracks were appearing in the facade of perfect compliance with Major Hayashi's directives. Reports came in from across Yokohama of Japanese civilians actively seeking out the black American soldiers for assistance, finding them less intimidating than their white counterparts in many cases. This development infuriated Hayashi, who called Akiko to his temporary office that evening. "Tanaka-san, "You are failing in your responsibility," he said coldly. "The women in your district are openly conversing with the Negro troops. This morning I witnessed 3 young women laughing with them. Major, with respect, the American soldiers are distributing vital supplies. Some conversation is unavoidable." "Nothing beyond functional necessity is acceptable," Hayashi insisted. "These interactions could be misinterpreted by occupation authorities. The Supreme Commander's headquarters has assured us that fraternization will be discouraged." Akiko bowed respectfully, but felt increasingly torn. In just 2 days, her own perceptions had begun shifting dramatically. The black soldiers she had worked alongside had shown nothing but professionalism and compassion, a stark contrast to both wartime propaganda and the current warnings from Japanese officials. That night, at the small apartment she shared with her sister and elderly grandmother, Akiko faced difficult questions. "Is it true what people are saying?" her grandmother asked as they ate a simple dinner supplemented with American rations. "That these black Americans are treating our people with respect?" "They are soldiers following orders," Akiko replied carefully. "That's not what I asked," the old woman persisted. "For years we were told Americans would slaughter us all if they won. Now they bring food and medicine. We were told especially to fear the black ones, yet today Mrs. Ito told me one carried her injured son 3 kilometers to the aid station." Yuki, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "I talked with one today. His name is Robert. He's from a place called Georgia and has a family farm there. He showed me pictures of his parents." "Yuki," Akiko exclaimed. Major Hayashi specifically forbade such personal interaction. "Major Hayashi isn't hungry," their grandmother observed dryly. "And Major Hayashi's propaganda didn't keep the Americans from winning the war." The following day brought rain, complicating distribution efforts. Lieutenant Washington ordered waterproof tarps erected to protect supplies and provide shelter for civilians waiting in line. He noticed that despite the weather, the crowd was even larger than the day before. "Word is spreading," Sergeant Jones noted. "People coming from further out now." "We'll need more translators," Washington decided. "Miss Tanaka can't handle this volume alone." As if summoned by mention of her name, Akiko appeared, soaking wet despite her umbrella. "Lieutenant, we have a situation at the eastern checkpoint. Several families from the countryside have arrived with sick children. They heard the Americans have penicillin." "Corporal Lewis," Washington called immediately. "Grab your medical kit and 3 men. Miss Tanaka will take you to these families." As Lewis gathered supplies, Washington noticed Major Hayashi watching from a staff car parked across the street. Their eyes met briefly before the Japanese officer looked away, his disapproval evident even at a distance. Throughout the 3rd day, interactions between Japanese civilians and black American soldiers continued to evolve. Women who had initially avoided eye contact now asked questions through translators. Children who had been kept hidden now approached soldiers openly. Even some elderly men, the most resistant to the occupation, grudgingly acknowledged the fairness of the distribution system established by Washington's unit. By late afternoon, a small crisis emerged when supplies ran short while hundreds still waited in line. Washington made a quick decision, ordering half rations to ensure everyone received something. As this instruction was translated, a murmur of surprise passed through the crowd. They had expected the Americans to simply send them away. "Tell them we'll have full distribution again tomorrow," Washington assured Akiko. "No one will be forgotten." As this message was relayed, an elderly man stepped forward and bowed deeply to Washington. The lieutenant, respecting the gesture, bowed in return. This simple exchange of mutual respect rippled through the watching crowd, challenging years of ingrained propaganda. That evening, Lieutenant Washington was summoned to Captain Miller's office in the occupation headquarters. "We have a situation, Lieutenant," Miller said without preamble. "The Japanese liaison officer, this Major Hayashi, has filed a formal complaint about your unit's conduct." Washington maintained his composure. "What specifically is the complaint, sir?" "He claims your men are encouraging inappropriate fraternization with Japanese women. Says they're undermining local authority by disregarding cultural protocols." My men are distributing supplies and providing medical assistance as ordered, sir. Any interaction has been professional and necessary for the mission. Miller sighed, revealing his own complicated position. Look, Washington, between us, you're doing good work. These people are seeing that Americans, including Negro Americans, aren't the devils they were told. But this complaint has gone up the chain. The brass doesn't want anything complicating the occupation. What are my orders, sir? Maintain the mission but minimize unnecessary interaction. Document everything. I'll handle Hayashi and his superiors. Miller paused. The truth is, your men are making a better impression than some of our white units. That fact won't make it into any official reports, but it hasn't gone unnoticed. When Washington returned to the barracks, he shared the situation with his senior NCOs. So we're doing too good a job, Sergeant Jones said with bitter humor, making the white boys look bad. We're following orders and completing our mission, Washington corrected firmly. But we need to be beyond reproach. No personal conversations, nothing that could be misinterpreted. Professional interaction only. Lieutenant, Corporal Lewis interjected, these people are starting to trust us. Pulling back now sends the wrong message. I understand that, Corporal, but we represent something larger than ourselves here. We can change minds through our actions while following orders to the letter. The next morning, the dynamics at the distribution center had shifted noticeably. Lieutenant Washington's men maintained strict professional distance, focusing entirely on the logistics of aid distribution. Japanese civilians, sensing this change, responded with confusion. Akiko arrived to find the atmosphere distinctly cooler. When she approached Lieutenant Washington for her daily briefing, she noticed his newly formal demeanor. Miss Tanaka, please inform district representatives that medical supplies are limited today. Priority cases only, he said without the conversational tone of previous days. Is something wrong, Lieutenant? She asked. Nothing's wrong, just maintaining proper protocols, he replied, echoing Major Hayashi's terminology so precisely that Akiko immediately understood. By midday, the impact of the complaint had rippled through both the American unit and the Japanese civilians they served. The easy rapport that had begun developing was replaced with mechanical efficiency. Private Johnson no longer smiled at the children or offered extra chocolate. Corporal Lewis processed medical cases with clinical detachment rather than reassurance. During her lunch break, Akiko encountered Yuki near the distribution point. Her sister appeared dejected. What happened? Yuki asked. Yesterday they were friendly. Today they won't even look at us. Before Akiko could answer, Major Hayashi approached, accompanied by 2 junior officers. You see, Tanaka-san, he said with evident satisfaction, proper protocols have been restored. This is how occupation forces should behave, professional and distant. Akiko bowed respectfully but remained silent, understanding now the source of the changed atmosphere. As the day progressed, the consequences of this forced distance became increasingly problematic. Without the trust that had been building, cooperation deteriorated. Civilians were reluctant to approach the medical station. The orderly distribution system became tense and inefficient. By late afternoon, the situation reached a breaking point when an elderly man collapsed while waiting in line. As medics rushed to assist, bystanders backed away, the newly reinforced barriers now psychological as well as physical. Corporal Lewis knelt beside the unconscious man, checking vital signs. He's severely dehydrated. I need someone to translate instructions for care. Akiko stepped forward, but Major Hayashi intercepted her. Sato will handle medical translations, he insisted. Sato-san isn't here, Major, Akiko pointed out. This man needs immediate help. For a moment, Hayashi hesitated, the conflict between protocol and humanity evident in his expression. Lieutenant Washington, observing from nearby, made a quiet decision. Miss Tanaka, he called, please assist Corporal Lewis. That's a direct request from occupation forces. The technical formulation gave Akiko the official cover she needed. As she knelt to translate Lewis's medical instructions to the man's family, something shifted in the watching crowd. The artificial distance imposed by protocol began to dissolve in the face of genuine human need. Later that evening, Lieutenant Washington sat alone in the command post, reviewing supply manifests when Captain Miller arrived unexpectedly. "Problem solved," Miller announced, seeming pleased with himself. "Sir, Major Hayashi has been reassigned. Effective immediately. Liaison duties will be handled by a Colonel Tanaka. No relation to your translator, apparently. He's a more progressive officer who served as a military attaché in Europe before the war." Washington considered this information carefully. "May I ask what prompted the change, sir?" Miller smiled slightly. "Let's just say General MacArthur's headquarters received reports about distribution efficiency under various liaison officers. The data showed your sector performing exceptionally well during the first 3 days, then a sudden decline coinciding with certain protocol adjustments." "Statistical analysis, sir?" "Precisely. Hard to argue with numbers." Miller's expression became more serious. "The occupation's success depends on changing hearts and minds, Lieutenant. Your men were doing that very effectively until someone interfered. Headquarters took notice." After Miller departed, Washington called his NCOs together. "Effective immediately, we return to standard operating procedures, professional but humane interaction with civilians. Our mission remains the same, efficient aid distribution and security, but we will not create artificial barriers to accomplishing that mission." Sergeant Jones nodded with satisfaction. "The men will be glad to hear it, Lieutenant. Felt wrong, acting like we had something to be ashamed of." "We represent the United States Army," Washington reminded them. "We show these people what America can be at its best, not its worst." The following morning brought immediate changes. Colonel Shigeru Tanaka, the new liaison officer, arrived early to introduce himself. In his 60s, with perfect English and a cosmopolitan manner, he represented a different faction within Japan's military, one that had argued against war with America and now sought pragmatic recovery. "Lieutenant Washington," he said with a proper military salute rather than a bow, "I look forward to working with your unit. My instructions are to facilitate effective occupation operations, not hinder them." Washington returned the salute. "Appreciated. Colonel, we're preparing for today's distribution now." "Excellent. I've brought additional translators, including some who studied in America before the war. They understand both cultures and can help bridge misunderstandings." As civilian workers set up the day's distribution point, Akiko arrived with her sister Yuki in tow. "Lieutenant," she said with evident relief, "we heard about Major Hayashi's reassignment." "Miss Tanaka," Washington acknowledged with professional courtesy, though his eyes conveyed more. "We're resuming normal operational protocols today." Throughout the morning, the atmosphere transformed. Without Hayashi's oppressive presence, Japanese civilians and American soldiers returned to the natural human interactions that had begun developing earlier. Women made eye contact, asked questions, expressed gratitude. Children approached soldiers without fear. Elderly people showed respect and received it in return. Private Johnson, helping distribute food packages, found himself surrounded by children again. When he pulled out chocolate bars, their excitement was unrestrained. "Lieutenant said we're back to being ourselves," Johnson explained to Hiroki, who was helping organize the children. "Good," the young man replied. "Major Hayashi's rules made no sense. How can we understand each other without looking at each other?" Nearby, Corporal Lewis had established a more comprehensive medical station, now assisted by 2 Japanese nurses. One of them, a young woman named Midori, who had trained at Tokyo Imperial University's nursing program, worked alongside him with professional efficiency. "Your techniques are different from what we were taught," she observed, watching him administer penicillin to a child with an infected wound. "American medicine advanced considerably during the war," Lewis explained. "I'd be happy to share what I know." "I would like to learn," she replied, their mutual respect for medical science transcending the barriers of recently ended conflict. By midday, the distribution center functioned better than it had at any point since the Americans' arrival. Colonel Tanaka, observing from a distance, nodded with satisfaction before approaching Lieutenant Washington. "Your men are changing perceptions, Lieutenant," the colonel remarked. "Perhaps you don't fully appreciate how revolutionary this is." "Sir, Japan has had limited contact with black people throughout its history," Tanaka explained. "What little most Japanese knew came from American films or German propaganda during our unfortunate alliance. To see Black American soldiers behaving with such discipline and humanity contradicts everything they were led to believe. Washington considered this. "Colonel, my men are just doing their job." "Perhaps," Tanaka acknowledged. "But in doing so, they challenge assumptions on both sides, don't they? Japanese civilians are learning that skin color doesn't determine character, and perhaps Americans are demonstrating that democratic principles can actually work in practice, not just theory." Late that afternoon, Akiko approached Lieutenant Washington with an unexpected request. "The Neighborhood Association has organized a small ceremony tonight," she explained. "They wish to formally thank your unit for the assistance provided this week." Washington hesitated. "That's not necessary, Miss Tanaka. We're simply following orders." "Please," she insisted. "It would mean a great deal. Colonel Tanaka has already approved." That evening, Washington brought his platoon to the community center, where local residents had prepared a modest but dignified ceremony. Despite the scarcity of resources, they had assembled small gifts, handmade paper cranes, calligraphy scrolls, even a few precious food items from personal supplies. An elderly man named Mr. Watanabe, who had served as the ward's representative for decades, addressed them through Akiko's translation. "1 week ago, we believed we faced only humiliation and suffering under occupation," he said, his voice strong despite his frail appearance. "We were told Americans would bring only cruelty, especially the black soldiers whom our leaders described as savages." Washington maintained his professional composure as Akiko carefully translated these frank admissions. Instead, Mr. Watanabe continued, "We have received food for our children, medicine for our sick, and respect for our dignity. You have shown us that humanity transcends borders, wars, and even the color of skin. For this lesson we are most grateful." As Japanese residents presented their modest gifts to the American soldiers, the weight of the moment was not lost on anyone present. Just days ago, these same civilians had been instructed not even to look at black soldiers. Now they bowed in sincere gratitude. Private Johnson leaned toward Sergeant Jones. "Never thought I'd see anything like this, Sarge. History happens in unexpected ways." "Son," Jones replied quietly, "remember this moment." Lieutenant Washington accepted a beautifully crafted calligraphy scroll from Mr. Watanabe, understanding that something profound had shifted in this small corner of occupied Japan. The scroll contained just 3 Japanese characters. "It says mutual respect," one Akiko translated, her eyes meeting Washington's without hesitation. "The foundation of true peace." As September turned to October, the dynamics in Yokohama continued to evolve. Lieutenant Washington's platoon had established a reliable routine, and the initial wariness of the local population had largely given way to pragmatic cooperation. What began as necessity was slowly transforming into genuine community engagement. The occupation authorities, recognizing the unit's effectiveness, expanded their jurisdiction to include neighboring districts. With this expansion came new challenges. Areas further from the center had received less accurate information about the Americans, and some villages still harbored fears based on wartime propaganda. Second Lieutenant Daniel Reynolds, recently assigned to Washington's command, discovered this firsthand when leading a supply mission to an outlying farming community. "The women literally ran inside when they saw us approaching," Reynolds reported upon returning. "The men stood their ground but wouldn't make eye contact or respond to our translator." Washington considered the information. "Similar to what we encountered initially. Who's the local authority figure?" "Village headman named Ito. Seems reasonable but extremely cautious. He accepted the supplies but discouraged any interaction beyond the handover." "We'll make another run tomorrow," Washington decided. "Same location, same time. Consistency builds trust." Sergeant Jones, who had been listening nearby, added, "Might help to bring Akiko instead of Sato." The male translators still maintained too much formality. Washington nodded. "Good suggestion. Also have Corporal Lewis prepare extra medical supplies. Healthcare access tends to be the fastest way to overcome resistance." This strategic approach to community relations had become the unit's unofficial specialty. Captain Miller had noted their success in his reports to headquarters, though Washington suspected these achievements were somewhat diluted as they moved up the chain of command. The next morning, As Washington's detail prepared for the return visit to the outlying village, Akiko arrived with unexpected news. "Lieutenant, Colonel Tanaka requests your presence at headquarters immediately," she said, slightly out of breath from hurrying. "A journalist has arrived from America." Washington raised an eyebrow. "A journalist? From something called the Pittsburgh Courier. Colonel Tanaka thought you should be informed directly." Washington immediately recognized the name of the prominent black newspaper. "Sergeant Jones, you'll lead the supply run today. I'll report to headquarters." At the occupation headquarters, Washington found Colonel Tanaka in conversation with a well-dressed black man in his 40s who carried a camera and notebook. "Lieutenant Washington," Colonel Tanaka greeted him, "this is Mr. William Peterson of the Pittsburgh Courier. He has permission from General MacArthur's headquarters to report on the occupation, with particular interest in Negro units." Peterson extended his hand. "Lieutenant, I've been following reports about your platoon's work here, not the official reports, the ones that make it back home through letters and returning servicemen." "Mr. Peterson," Washington acknowledged, shaking the journalist's hand firmly, "we're simply carrying out our assigned duties." "That modesty might work with the Army brass, Lieutenant. But I've been covering Negro achievements too long to be deflected so easily," Peterson replied with a knowing smile. "Word has reached stateside about how your men are changing perceptions here. It's a powerful story, one that needs telling." Colonel Tanaka, showing his diplomatic skills, suggested, "Perhaps Mr. Peterson could accompany your unit today. Observe your work firsthand." Washington hesitated only briefly. "Of course, sir. We're conducting a follow-up supply mission to Kitamoto village this morning." As they drove toward the village in a requisitioned truck, Peterson explained his mission more fully. "The Courier has been documenting the Negro experience in this war from the beginning," he said. "Our readership wants to know that their sacrifices meant something beyond just defeating the Axis." "And what exactly are you hoping to document here?" Washington asked carefully. "The irony isn't lost on anyone back home, Lieutenant. Negro soldiers who can't get served at lunch counters in Alabama are now representatives of American democracy in Asia." Peterson gestured at the passing landscape. "But something unexpected is happening here. You and your men are being judged on your actions, not your skin color, possibly for the first time in your military careers." Washington maintained his professional reserve. "Mr. Peterson, I appreciate the Pittsburgh Courier's interest, but my men don't see themselves as making any political statement. They're soldiers doing their duty. Sometimes the most powerful statements are made by those who aren't trying to make them at all," Peterson replied. "I'm here to observe, Lieutenant, not create a narrative." When they arrived at Kitamoto village, Washington was surprised to see Sergeant Jones's team already engaged in animated conversation with locals. The fearful reception of the previous day had transformed into cautious engagement. "What changed?" Washington asked as he approached. Jones grinned. "Corporal Lewis diagnosed an infant with a treatable infection. Word spread fast after that." Peterson observed the scene with professional interest, occasionally making notes or taking photographs. He paid particular attention to the interactions between black soldiers and Japanese women, who were now bringing forward children for medical checks or helping distribute supplies. An elderly woman approached Washington, bowing respectfully before speaking to Akiko in rapid Japanese. "She says her grandson has been ill for weeks," Akiko translated. "The local doctor had no medicine. She wants to know if your medic can help." "Tell her Corporal Lewis will examine him," Washington replied. As Akiko translated, he noticed Peterson watching the exchange intently. Throughout the morning, Peterson documented the methodical, respectful approach of Washington's men. He interviewed several soldiers, including Private Johnson, whose natural charm transcended language barriers. "Back home, they cross the street when they see me coming," Johnson told the journalist candidly. "Here, they're starting to smile and bow. It's like being on another planet." By midday, the atmosphere in the village had transformed completely. Children who had hidden behind doors now followed American soldiers with undisguised curiosity. Women who had fled at first sight now offered tea and what few refreshments they could spare. The village headman, Mr. Ito, approached Washington and Peterson as they supervised the final distribution. "Please tell your commander that we are grateful," Ito said through Akiko. "We had heard terrible stories about American soldiers, especially—" He paused, looking uncomfortable. Especially the black ones, Peterson supplied directly. Ito nodded after Akiko translated. Our military leaders told us you would behave like animals, that you would harm our women and children. And now? Washington asked. Now we see the reality, Ito replied simply. Actions speak more truth than words. On the drive back to Yokohama, Peterson was unusually quiet, organizing his notes and thoughts. Finally, he said, "Do you realize what's happening here, Lieutenant?" "We're establishing effective occupation protocols," Washington replied formally. "No," Peterson corrected. "You're conducting one of the most effective propaganda campaigns in modern history, without even trying to." Meaning? For years, the Japanese government told its people that Americans, especially Negro Americans, were subhuman devils. In just weeks, your men have completely dismantled that narrative through nothing more complicated than basic human decency. Peterson tapped his notebook. And here's what makes it a truly important story. You're not just changing Japanese perceptions about Negro Americans. You're demonstrating what America could be if it actually lived up to its stated principles. Washington remained silent, uncomfortable with the political implications, yet unable to deny the truth of Peterson's observation. Back at headquarters, Peterson met with Colonel Tanaka to arrange further visits with other Negro units operating in the occupation zone. Washington returned to his command post to find an unexpected visitor waiting, Yuki Tanaka, Akiko's younger sister. "Miss Tanaka," Washington acknowledged, surprised. "Can I help you with something?" Yuki bowed nervously. "Lieutenant, I have come without my sister's knowledge. There is something you should be aware of." "Go on." "Major Hayashi has been meeting with other former officers. They are disturbed by the friendship developing between Japanese women and black American soldiers." Yuki's discomfort was evident, but she continued. "They are spreading stories in outlying areas, claiming women who interact with Negro troops are being dishonored." Washington frowned. "I thought Major Hayashi had been reassigned." "From official duties, yes, but his influence remains, especially among those who cannot accept defeat." She hesitated. "There is to be a meeting tonight at the Lotus Temple. They plan to organize resistance to cultural corruption, as they call it." "Thank you for this information, Miss Tanaka. I'll inform Colonel Tanaka immediately." After Yuki departed, Washington considered the implications. What had begun as a straightforward occupation assignment was increasingly entangled with complex social dynamics that extended far beyond military considerations. That evening, Washington met with Captain Miller and Colonel Tanaka to discuss the developing situation. "We should shut down this meeting," Miller suggested immediately. "Gather up these former officers and ship them to Tokyo for questioning." Colonel Tanaka shook his head. "With respect, Captain, such heavy-handed tactics would only validate their narrative of American oppression. Remember, they're not planning violent resistance, merely social pressure." "What do you suggest, Colonel?" Washington asked. "Transparency," Tanaka replied. "These men operate through whispers and innuendo. They rely on people's ignorance and fear. Let us combat this with open information." "A public forum." Miller sounded skeptical. "Precisely. An opportunity for Japanese civilians to ask questions directly of American authorities, including Lieutenant Washington's men." Tanaka turned to Washington. "Would your soldiers be willing to participate in such an event?" Washington considered the proposal. "If properly structured, yes, but we'd need assurances of security." "Of course," Tanaka agreed. "We could hold it at the municipal auditorium with appropriate protocols." The following morning, announcements were posted throughout Yokohama about the public forum scheduled for 2 days later. The response was immediate and significant, both positive and negative. Lines formed at ward offices to register attendance. Rumors circulated about what would actually occur. Akiko, who had been assigned to help organize the translation team for the event, reported varied reactions among local residents. "Many are eager to attend," she told Washington during their daily briefing, "especially those who have already benefited from the aid distribution, but others are suspicious, believing it's a propaganda exercise." "And what about Hayashi's group?" "They're encouraging people to boycott," she confirmed. "They've even posted notices claiming women who attend will be compromising their honor." Despite these countermeasures, interest in the forum continued to grow. Peterson, the Pittsburgh Courier journalist, recognized the historical significance and arranged to extend his stay in Japan to cover the event. "This is unprecedented," he told Washington the day before the forum. "An occupying force holding a public dialogue with the defeated population, addressing racial perceptions head-on. Nothing like this happened in Germany." "It wasn't my idea," Washington noted. "No, but your unit's conduct made it possible," Peterson replied. "If your men had behaved like conquering heroes or confirmed Japanese propaganda in any way, no such forum would be conceivable." On the morning of the event, the municipal auditorium was filled beyond capacity. Colonel Tanaka had arranged a structured program, beginning with statements from occupation authorities, followed by a moderated question-and-answer session. Security was present, but deliberately unobtrusive. Captain Miller opened the proceedings with a formal explanation of occupation policies, emphasizing that the American presence was temporary and aimed at establishing a democratic foundation for Japan's future. His words were translated by a professional interpreter from MacArthur's headquarters. Then Colonel Tanaka introduced Lieutenant Washington, who would represent the operational units directly engaging with Japanese civilians. A murmur ran through the crowd as Washington took the stage. Many had encountered black American soldiers by now, but seeing one in a position of authority remained novel. "Good morning," Washington began, his voice steady and clear. "My name is Lieutenant Marcus Washington of the United States Army. My men and I have been stationed in your community for several weeks now, distributing supplies and assisting with reconstruction efforts. We recognize that our presence represents significant change after years of conflict, and we understand that questions and concerns are natural." As the translator conveyed his words, Washington scanned the audience. He noted familiar faces, residents from districts under his unit's jurisdiction, local officials who had worked alongside his men, even some children who had become regular visitors to distribution points. But there were also many he didn't recognize, including a group of stern-faced men in the back who he suspected were Hayashi's associates. "I am here today to answer your questions honestly," Washington continued, "not as a representative of policy which Captain Miller has addressed, but as a soldier working directly in your neighborhoods every day." The moderator, a respected professor who had taught at both Japanese and American universities before the war, opened the floor for questions. After a moment of hesitation, an elderly man rose. "We were told for many years that Americans, especially black Americans, were savage and cruel," the man said, his directness causing some discomfort in the audience. "Why have you treated us with respect instead of revenge?" The bluntness of the question created a momentary silence. Washington considered his response carefully. "My men and I serve the United States Army, which has clear protocols for occupation duties," he began formally before shifting to a more personal tone. "But perhaps more importantly, we understand what it means to be judged based on false information. In America, Negro citizens have often been mischaracterized and mistreated based on prejudice rather than reality. We know the importance of being judged by our actions rather than by propaganda." As this was translated, a ripple of recognition moved through the audience. The parallel between their own experience of being defined by enemy propaganda and the black Americans' experience in their own country was not lost on them. A middle-aged woman stood next. "Is it true that Negro soldiers are forbidden from speaking with Japanese women? Major Hayashi told us this was American policy." Washington noticed several occupation officials shifting uncomfortably. The question touched directly on the tension between American racial segregation policies and occupation protocols. "There is no specific policy restricting interaction between Negro soldiers and Japanese civilians of any gender," Washington answered carefully. "All American personnel are expected to behave with professionalism and respect local customs. Any specific restrictions previously communicated were not official occupation policy." This answer, diplomatically phrased, nevertheless directly contradicted Hayashi's claims. Washington noticed the former major and several associates in the rear of the auditorium, their expressions darkening. Questions continued for over an hour, ranging from practical matters about aid distribution to more pointed inquiries about American racial policies. Washington navigated each with professional precision, neither overstating progress on racial issues in America nor avoiding uncomfortable truths. Toward the end of the session, a young woman rose. Washington recognized her as one of the nurses who had been working with Corporal Lewis at the medical station. "I have observed that Negro soldiers seem more comfortable interacting with Japanese civilians than some white soldiers," she said. "Is this because you understand what it means to be treated as inferior?" A tense silence followed. The question cut to the heart of unspoken parallels between Japan's racial ideology and America's own contradictions. Captain Miller, seated nearby, stiffened visibly. Washington took a measured breath. "I cannot speak for all Negro soldiers, nor would I presume to compare our experiences directly to yours. What I can say is that my men understand that humanity transcends superficial differences. We judge individuals by their character and actions, not by appearance or propaganda. That is a principle worth defending, even when our own nation falls short of it." As the translator conveyed these words, Peterson scribbled furiously in his notebook. The audience remained absolutely silent, absorbing the implications. After the formal session concluded, many attendees lingered, approaching American personnel with additional questions or simply to express appreciation for the unprecedented dialogue. Peterson moved through the crowd, gathering impressions and reactions for his article. Major Hayashi and his associates had departed immediately, their boycott having failed but their opposition clearly undiminished. Colonel Tanaka approached Washington as the auditorium gradually emptied. "That was masterfully handled, Lieutenant," the colonel said quietly. "You addressed sensitive questions without creating diplomatic incidents. Quite a balancing act." "Thank you, sir. I'm just glad it remained civil." "This won't be the end of resistance," Tanaka cautioned. "Major Hayashi represents a faction that cannot accept the new reality, not just defeat, but the collapse of racial hierarchies they believed were natural law." "We'll continue focusing on our mission," Washington assured him. "The most effective response to propaganda is consistent action that contradicts it." In the days following the public forum, its impact became increasingly evident throughout Yokohama. Attendance at distribution centers increased significantly. Japanese civilians approached black soldiers with noticeably less hesitation. Even in outlying areas, the reception of supply missions improved dramatically. Peterson's comprehensive article for the Pittsburgh Courier, portions of which were later reprinted in mainstream American publications, described the unprecedented social experiment unfolding in occupied Japan. He documented how black American soldiers, through professional conduct and basic humanity, were dismantling decades of racial propaganda more effectively than any official policy could have accomplished. For Lieutenant Washington's unit, however, daily operations continued without fanfare. Supply distributions, security patrols, and infrastructure assessments remained their primary focus. If the soldiers noticed Japanese women now making direct eye contact or engaging in conversation more freely, they maintained professional demeanor while naturally reciprocating this growing normalization. One evening in late October, Washington was completing paperwork in the command post when Sergeant Jones entered with a concerned expression. "Lieutenant, we may have a situation developing," Jones reported. "Private Johnson hasn't returned from his supply inventory at the harbor warehouse." Washington checked his watch. "He's only an hour overdue, could be delayed by inventory discrepancies." "That's what I thought initially, sir. But Corporal Williams just returned from the same location and says Johnson never arrived for the scheduled inventory." Washington's concern immediately escalated. "Has anyone checked with the military police?" "Yes, sir. No incidents reported involving our personnel." "Assemble a search detail. Check the route between here and the harbor. I'll inform Captain Miller." As Washington reached for the field telephone, Akiko burst into the command post, her normally composed demeanor visibly shaken. "Lieutenant, you must come quickly," she exclaimed. "There's been an incident at the tea house near the eastern checkpoint." "What kind of incident? Is Private Johnson involved?" "Yes," she confirmed. "He intervened when several former Japanese officers were harassing women who work at the checkpoint." They're saying he violated occupation protocols by interfering in a Japanese matter. Washington and Jones exchanged knowing looks. Major Hayashi. Yes, Akiko nodded. He is demanding that your soldier be disciplined publicly to restore proper relations. Washington grabbed his sidearm and cap. Sergeant, bring 2 men and follow me. Miss Tanaka, please locate Colonel Tanaka immediately and inform him of the situation. The Eastern Checkpoint had become a small commercial hub where local vendors provided food and services to both Japanese civilians and American personnel. The tea house in question was operated by an elderly couple who had become known for welcoming both populations, making it a natural flashpoint for those opposed to normalization. When Washington arrived, he found Johnson standing at rigid attention, while Major Hayashi, in civilian clothes but with unmistakable military bearing, addressed a growing crowd of onlookers. 2 other former officers stood nearby, along with several young women who appeared distressed. This Negro soldier has overstepped his authority, Hayashi was saying as a colleague translated his words into English. He has interfered with Japanese citizens conducting their own affairs. This demonstrates the true nature of the American occupation, not liberation, but domination. Washington approached calmly but directly. Major Hayashi, I am Lieutenant Washington, commanding officer of this soldier. What precisely is the complaint? Before Hayashi could answer, one of the young women stepped forward despite attempts by the former officers to silence her. She spoke rapidly in Japanese, looking between Washington and Johnson. An older man emerged from the tea house and offered translation. She says these men were demanding that the tea house stop serving Negro soldiers. When she and other workers refused, they became threatening. Your soldier intervened only after one grabbed her arm. Hayashi interrupted with his own version. This is internal Japanese business. Occupation forces have no authority to intervene in social matters between Japanese citizens. By now, a significant crowd had gathered, including both Japanese civilians and American military personnel. The potential for escalation was evident. Washington needed to defuse the situation without creating a larger incident. Private Johnson, Washington addressed his soldier directly, report your actions. Johnson maintained perfect military bearing. Sir, I was proceeding to my assigned duty at the harbor warehouse when I heard a disturbance. A Japanese woman appeared to be in distress, being physically restrained by a civilian male. I approached and requested that he release her, which he refused to do. I then stated that I would report the incident to military police if he didn't release her immediately. At that point, sir, he released her but began making claims about my exceeding authority. Washington turned to address the gathering crowd, speaking slowly to allow for translation. Occupation regulations clearly prohibit violence against civilians, both by occupation forces and between civilians in our presence. Private Johnson acted in accordance with standing orders to prevent potential harm. Hayashi was not deterred. This is merely a pretext for interfering in Japanese social order. These women have been fraternizing inappropriately with Negro troops, against the guidance of their own community leaders. At this moment, Colonel Tanaka arrived, quickly assessing the situation. He addressed Hayashi directly in Japanese, their exchange becoming increasingly heated. The crowd watched with intense interest as 2 Japanese military men, one embracing cooperation with the occupation, the other resisting it, confronted each other. Finally, Colonel Tanaka turned to Washington. Lieutenant, this matter should be resolved through proper channels. I suggest you order your soldier to return to base while I address our Japanese citizens directly. Washington recognized the diplomatic necessity. Private Johnson, you are ordered to return to base immediately with Sergeant Jones, report to Captain Miller and provide a full statement. Yes, sir, Johnson replied, saluting sharply before departing with Jones. As they left, Washington noticed something unexpected. Several Japanese women from the tea house bowing respectfully to Johnson as he passed. This simple gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude, performed publicly despite Hayashi's presence, carried profound significance that wasn't lost on the watching crowd. Colonel Tanaka then addressed the gathered Japanese civilians in their own language, speaking at length about occupation protocols and the boundaries of authority. Though Washington couldn't understand the specific words, he recognized from the crowd's reactions that Tanaka was systematically dismantling Hayashi's position. Later that evening, at an emergency meeting in occupation headquarters, Captain Miller, Colonel Tanaka, and Lieutenant Washington discussed the implications of the incident. "This was a deliberate provocation," Tanaka stated flatly. "Hayashi selected that location knowing your soldiers frequented it. He was hoping to create exactly this kind of confrontation. The question is why," Miller added. "What does he gain from provoking an incident?" "Validation," Washington suggested. "His influence depends on Japanese civilians believing that Americans, particularly Negro Americans, represent a threat rather than assistance. Our effectiveness undermines his narrative." Colonel Tanaka nodded. "Precisely. And now we must decide how to respond. Ignoring this would suggest weakness, but overreacting plays into his strategy." After careful deliberation, they settled on an approach that would address the incident while reinforcing positive relations. The following day, Captain Miller issued a formal clarification of occupation protocols, emphasizing that American personnel were duty-bound to prevent violence regardless of who was involved. Simultaneously, Colonel Tanaka arranged for the tea house owners to receive special recognition for promoting peaceful community relations. Most significantly, Washington implemented a new procedure where each supply distribution would include a formal introduction of the American personnel present, creating official acknowledgement of the black soldiers as individuals rather than anonymous representatives of occupation forces. 2 days later, the Pittsburgh Courier's Peterson witnessed this new approach in action during a major supply distribution in central Yokohama. "Ladies and gentlemen," Washington announced through Akiko's translation, "today's medical assistance will be supervised by Corporal Benjamin Lewis, formerly a nursing student at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Corporal Lewis has treated wounded soldiers from 5 different nations during this conflict and now brings that expertise to civilian medical support." As Lewis stepped forward, receiving respectful acknowledgement from the gathered civilians, Peterson captured the moment with his camera. The image, a black American medical corporal being formally recognized before Japanese civilians who just months earlier had been enemy populations, would eventually become one of the defining photographs of the early occupation period. "You understand what you're doing here, don't you?" Peterson asked Washington privately afterward. Following updated protocols for community relations, Washington replied with professional detachment, though his eyes conveyed deeper understanding. "You're humanizing your men," Peterson said, "not just as American soldiers, but as individuals with histories, expertise, and identities beyond their uniform or skin color. It's brilliantly simple and devastatingly effective against propaganda that depends on dehumanization." Throughout November, this approach expanded across all interaction points between Washington's unit and the Japanese civilian population. Each soldier was introduced with specific details about their hometown, civilian occupation, or special skills. What began as a protocol became increasingly natural, as Japanese civilians began asking questions about these personal details, creating genuine human connections across previously impenetrable barriers. By early December, the impact of these evolving relationships was unmistakable throughout Washington's jurisdiction. Attendance at distribution points had stabilized into predictable patterns. Medical clinics operated with mixed American-Japanese staffing. Even recreation areas saw increasing integration, with impromptu baseball games becoming a common sight in cleared areas near the harbor. Major Hayashi's influence, meanwhile, visibly diminished. His public appearances became less frequent, his supporters fewer. Colonel Tanaka reported that even among conservative military circles, pragmatic cooperation was increasingly seen as the only viable path forward. On a crisp December morning, Washington received unexpected orders to report to occupation headquarters. Upon arrival, he found not only Captain Miller and Colonel Tanaka, but also a brigadier general from MacArthur's Tokyo staff. "Lieutenant Washington," the general began without preamble, "I've reviewed the operational reports from your sector over the past 3 months. The statistics are quite remarkable. Highest efficiency in aid distribution, lowest incident rate, and most importantly, highest civilian satisfaction metrics across the entire Kanto region. Thank you, sir. My men have worked diligently to fulfill their mission. Indeed. The general studied Washington thoughtfully. What's particularly notable is that these results have been achieved by a Negro unit in a country that was, until very recently, heavily influenced by Nazi racial ideology. That represents not just military efficiency, but a significant diplomatic achievement. Washington remained professionally reserved, uncertain where this evaluation was heading. General MacArthur's staff is establishing specialized occupation units focused on cultural engagement and democratic transition, the general continued. Based on your unit's demonstrated effectiveness, I'm recommending that your platoon be expanded to company strength and assigned to this specialized role. The implications were significant, not just increased responsibility, but formal recognition of the approach Washington's unit had pioneered. Your men will receive additional training in civil affairs, the general explained. You'll be tasked with implementing community engagement protocols across multiple districts, essentially scaling up what you've already accomplished here in Yokohama. We'd be honored to accept this assignment, sir, Washington replied, maintaining professional composure despite the unprecedented nature of the opportunity. For a black officer to receive such an expansion of authority was virtually unheard of, even under combat conditions. After the meeting, Captain Miller congratulated Washington privately. This is well-deserved, Lieutenant, though I suspect not everyone at headquarters is thrilled about a Negro-led unit receiving such a high-profile assignment. Probably not, sir, Washington acknowledged, but the results speak for themselves. Indeed they do. And that's the real victory here, being judged by results rather than preconceptions. As Washington prepared to inform his men of their new assignment, he found Akiko waiting outside headquarters. Something in her expression told him she already knew about the development. Colonel Tanaka mentioned your unit's new role, she confirmed. It's well-deserved recognition, Lieutenant. Thank you, Miss Tanaka. I hope you'll continue working with us in this expanded capacity. I would be honored, she replied. After a moment's hesitation, she added, There's something else you should know. Word of your unit's approach has spread beyond Yokohama. My cousin in Kobe writes that people there have heard about the black American soldiers who treat Japanese civilians with respect rather than contempt. That's good to hear, though we're just following proper protocols. It's more significant than you might realize, she insisted. Japan is rebuilding not just physically but psychologically. The discovery that everything we were taught about Americans, especially black Americans, was false is transformative. It makes people question what other certainties might also be false. Washington considered this perspective thoughtfully. Change is rarely comfortable, even when necessary. No, she agreed. But seeing your men, who by all accounts should have the most reason to be bitter or vengeful, instead showing professionalism and humanity, it gives people hope that reconciliation is possible. That evening, as Washington shared the news with his men, their reactions ranged from pride to cautious optimism. For soldiers who had grown accustomed to being overlooked or undervalued despite their contributions, this formal recognition represented something profound. They're actually acknowledging what we've accomplished, Sergeant Jones remarked, his typical reserve giving way to genuine satisfaction. Don't get too comfortable, Washington cautioned. With expanded responsibility comes increased scrutiny. We'll need to maintain perfect discipline. Always do, Lieutenant, Corporal Lewis noted with a smile. Though I must admit, it's something special to be recognized for building something rather than just fighting. Private Johnson, whose confrontation with Major Hayashi had inadvertently accelerated many of these developments, appeared thoughtful. Sir, do you think any of this will matter when we get back home? Will any of it change things in Georgia or Mississippi? The question hung in the air, touching the contradiction that every black soldier carried, fighting for democracy abroad while being denied its full promise at home. I can't say for certain, Washington answered honestly. But I know this. What we've done here matters. We've shown what's possible when people are judged by their actions rather than by prejudice. That truth doesn't stop being true just because some refuse to see it. In the months that followed, Washington's expanded unit implemented their community engagement approach across multiple districts. Their success became a case study in effective occupation management, though official reports often downplayed the significance of a Negro-led unit achieving these results. Peterson's articles in the Pittsburgh Courier, however, told the full story. His photographs and first-hand accounts documented the remarkable transformation as Japanese civilians, who had been taught to fear Black Americans as subhuman, came to respect and even admire the very soldiers they had been conditioned to dread. By the spring of 1946, the scenes in Washington's jurisdiction would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Japanese children playing baseball under the coaching of Black American GIs, women working alongside soldiers at community rebuilding projects, elderly men exchanging life stories despite language barriers, former enemies finding common humanity across the divisions of race, nationality, and recent conflict. On a warm April afternoon, as cherry blossoms transformed the war-scarred landscape, Lieutenant Washington stood watching his men supervising a food distribution that now operated with almost entirely Japanese staffing. Beside him, Colonel Tanaka observed with evident satisfaction. "When you first arrived," Tanaka remarked, "Major Hayashi instructed women not to even look at your soldiers. Now they work together daily without a second thought. People adapt when given the chance," Washington replied, "on both sides." "Indeed." Tanaka gazed thoughtfully at the scene before them. "You know, Lieutenant, historians will study this occupation for generations. They'll analyze policies, economics, political reforms. But I wonder if they'll fully capture what happened here, how perception was transformed through direct human experience." "Perhaps not," Washington acknowledged. "Some transformations can only be understood by those who live through them." Nearby, Akiko was explaining distribution procedures to newly arrived civilians. Her sister Yuki chatted easily with Private Johnson as they organized registration cards. The tea house owners who had defied Hayashi's intimidation now supplied meals for both American soldiers and Japanese workers at the distribution center. "Your men will return to America eventually," Tanaka noted. "What will they take from this experience?" Washington considered the question carefully. "Knowledge that can't be unlearned. They've experienced being judged by their character rather than their color. That changes a man's understanding of what's possible." "And the Japanese civilians who have come to know them? A similar revelation, perhaps. The discovery that humanity exists beyond the categories we're taught to believe in." As their conversation concluded, Washington noticed Peterson capturing one final series of photographs before his scheduled return to America. The journalist focused particularly on the natural, unforced interactions between Japanese civilians and Black American soldiers, images that directly contradicted decades of racial propaganda on both sides. "These pictures tell a story words never could," Peterson commented when he joined them. "Negro soldiers rebuilding rather than destroying, Japanese civilians responding with respect rather than fear, both sides discovering that humanity transcends the artificial barriers we construct." "Will your readers understand the significance?" Tanaka inquired. "Some will," Peterson affirmed. "Others might need time. But truth has a weight that eventually breaks through, even when resistance is strong." As the occupation continued through 1946 and beyond, the approaches pioneered by Washington's unit became increasingly standard, though rarely with acknowledgement of their origin. The history of Black American soldiers transforming Japanese perceptions through direct experience remained largely a footnote in official accounts of the occupation. But for those who lived through it, both the soldiers who experienced being judged by their character rather than color, and the Japanese civilians who discovered that humanity existed beyond propaganda, the impact was indelible. A generation of Japanese who had been taught to fear Black Americans as subhuman instead encountered men of dignity, discipline, and compassion. Years later, when discussing the occupation period, elderly Japanese would often mention with particular respect the Black American soldiers who had treated them with unexpected humanity during those vulnerable early months after surrender. What began with instructions not to look at Black GIs had transformed into one of history's most profound examples of perception changed through direct human experience. Lieutenant Washington would eventually return to an America still struggling with its own contradictions, where his leadership in Japan earned him respect from military peers, yet didn't exempt him from segregation at home. But he carried with him the knowledge that when artificial barriers are removed, genuine human connection becomes not just possible, but inevitable. For the women of Yokohama, who had been warned not to look at black American soldiers, yet found themselves unable to stop watching as these men demonstrated humanity their propaganda had denied, the lesson was equally transformative. They had witnessed firsthand how direct experience could dismantle even the most entrenched prejudice, revealing a universal humanity that transcended the artificial divisions of race, nationality, and recent enmity. In this unexpected way, amid the ruins of history's most destructive conflict, former enemies discovered a shared truth, that humanity exists in fullness beyond the narrow categories of propaganda, and that reconciliation begins with the simple act of truly seeing one another. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.